Alright, welcome to the last topic of this blog, and here we want to talk about some factors of space demand. So we've long talked around this and talked about, okay, what is really determining the demand for space and location, and now we want to dive into a few of these. And the idea is, well, you might think, okay, well, but you just told us, well, that there is this high and best use principle, and there's the density and urban versus rural, and that's all true, but obviously, with time, things change, and especially the demand for things change, and we see these, for example, in recent time with COVID and Corona, the idea of traveling to work and so on is all a little bit disrupted. And we have to assess how this will affect the demand in the future. So do we still really need these prime offices, right, in the center? Because if we can work from home or study from home, why would we want to move to university town, right, and spend a lot of money for that? So, and we have to always keep these real life factors in mind. And it is very, let's say, it's very, very complex to identify all possible factors, as you can imagine. But if you should get a feeling for it, and that's really important. So you should work, so to say, considered as an analyst in this sense, but also, well, obviously, to a certain extent, right? So don't overdo it. Generally, what we do is we move from a macro to a micro view. So what does that mean? That means that we look at big factors, big, substantial macro factors, and then we see how will this be for a specific location. And I will show you a few examples, and then hopefully you get the idea. So the first thing is, that's why we always differentiate the property classes. Because, for example, we have here residential, retail, office, industrial, and for these different classes or space usages, I use this interchangeably here, we have different factors of demand. So, for example, if we talk about residential space, what is really important is population, right? So, how many people are there? How many people are moving into my area? How many people are, let's say, first of all, how many people are in my country? So, if I'm, if I see strong inflows of migrants or so, well, that's, first of all, we talk on the country, but then also, where do these migrants go? Do they go to the city? Do they go to the rural area? Which city? And so on. The second thing is household formation. It's a bit of a long-term trend, but we see changes in the household formation, as I said. I'll show you in a second. Then it's GDP per capita, and so on and so on. But now if we, for example, look at retail, which factors drive retail? Well, it's also about population, obviously. So a few of these factors, they affect every aspect. But when we talk about retail, it comes way more into what's the income, for example. So if I want to open the next Gucci store, well, I need to be sure that that city or that area has a lot of wealthy people that can afford to buy Gucci clothes, right? Because so I want to look at the income and where do high income people go. And also I want to look at shopping trends. We have e-commerce, we have Amazon, we have eBay, and we have a lot of local competitors. So, and we want to analyze this. So how's the consumption behavior, and so on and so on. And so you see the factors, if we consider residential property versus a retail property, they're very different. So we have to, first of all, define, obviously, the space usage, the property class, and then we start the analysis on the different trends and demand factors. For this example, let me focus on residential. As said, it's very complex, and we could do this in another 2 hours to talk about these factors, but then we would also have to define the market, right? So which country, which location do we have in mind? Usually we start with a certain location with an idea, let's say buying a apartment building in one major US city, or we already have a certain city, and then we start. We have the market defined, we have the property class defined, and then we can apply these factors. So a few facts and figures that might be interesting, I think, for you is world population. So let's start with world population. Well, if you look at this, then we see that this is a very, very, very long run perspective. Then we see that in recent years, the world population is growing like crazy, right? So this graph suggests that the demand for space will just increase. But turns out, if we zoom a little bit in, then it's not everywhere the same, because what we see is that actually for example, in Europe here, we see that over time, from 1960 onwards, the population in Europe increased, and well, these are the data points, and you can see a lot of data points in the last few years. And then we have here the forecast. But we see that it's forecasted that we are actually in Europe at our peak. So if we see the population growth, then actually now it's around 0 and it will turn negative soon. So the European population is shrinking, and this has different factors that we look in a second. But yeah, so it's not like the whole world is just like growing up, but certain places are growing and certain places are shrinking. And then if we zoom in further, now we were at the European perspective, well, then we can also see that, for example, people here, this is the urban population share, and we started in the 1950s or so with around the share of 55, so 55% of Europe, or a country in general, on average, lived in a city, and we can see how this share increased over time. So now already we are at 70%, so around 70% of the population live in cities these days, 30% live in the rural area, and this trend is increasing. So we see this clear trend of these mega cities growing and pulling away the population from the rural areas. And I have an example here from Germany. This is estimated population changes until the year 2025, and we can see, I mean, if you're familiar with Germany, there are 4 big cities: Hamburg, Berlin, here Cologne and Munich, and we see that especially, for example, Munich area is growing and growing and growing, and Berlin is usually also growing, but it drags away all these people from the rural area that become more moving to the city, right? And the different reasons for that. But yeah, these are definitely the trends that we see, right? So now we zoomed into Europe, and well, we said it's shrinking, but it's not all bad necessarily, because the European cities, the urban areas, are actually growing, or projected to grow. But this was, to be honest, this was estimated before Corona, so I'm not sure if the forecast changed. Then another thing is household income, or household size. So individuals in high income countries, at least, they are getting wealthier over time. The living quality increases. And then what we see is that healthy individuals can form their household faster. And that's usually what we do, or what they do. So as soon as people or humans get more wealth, they want to have their freedom. We have this culture you see in Europe and the US that people, when they start to go to university, they move out. Not everywhere. We still have places where income is not so high, and there we see that people, or like students, they tend to stay way longer at their parents' place than places where the income is way higher, right? So, but what does that mean for real estate? It means that the household size decreases, right? So households become smaller. Means apartments usually, well, even though we occupy more space per person, we don't need it anymore. So we need more apartments, but we need smaller apartments. And that's so to say the demand, the kind of what the product, when you see real estate as a product, as an investor, you offer a product, a property, then you need to change the specification of your property to stay in the trend. And here is a statistic, a long run statistic, because obviously household size is nothing that changes in a few weeks or month. But for the US, and what you actually see is that the household size decreases. So from on average 3.01 to 2.54 people. We also see that the average American, the house size increases. So, and that's what I just said. Well, as we usually in these rich income countries, we occupy way more space per person. But we also form smaller households. So we want to have our own space. But if we compare this to, let's say, as you can see here, to our parents' generation in the same age, or like, well, I don't want to say grandparents, I'm not that old, but you can see that the occupation is nearly double the space, right? So, yeah, it's a bit of an opposing trend. But the question is obviously, yeah, well, then we would have to slice it further into maybe the age groups. And that's exactly what a few people did. And then this is where this idea of student housing emerged. So besides that younger people move out sooner, we also see that younger people today are more likely to go to visit the university. A degree becomes more and more important. And as said, in these high income countries, people that go to university usually move out from their home. But obviously they cannot afford to take up a lot of space because they're still students. And that's where the industry shaped towards this student housing, which became a very special property class. So it's usually what it is that it's an apartment. You can imagine it as an apartment building where you have very, very small apartments for students only. And then you have some kind of shared areas, for example, kitchens, if the apartments don't have their own kitchen, but sometimes they do. Or you have nice amenities where people can go and study, or maybe a gym where they can work out and so on. And yeah, and I think it's, first of all, it's a preference thing. And the second thing is, I mean, we use the space in a different way, right? So we adjusted to the demand for housing. And you can see that actually that this is a report from Catella that this, the transactions, they're actually increasing so that the prices of these units, they go up and up and up. So it's really lucrative business, especially in the UK. Another thing is aging, and I'm speeding up a bit because I mean, we can go on for hours here. Said aging is a big problem in Europe. I just showed you the population is shrinking, and one of these reasons is aging. So we get older and older. There are studies that also show that as people are more wealthy, they have less kids on average. So, well, obviously Europe is a quite wealthy area. So at some point people got less and less kids, and well, people got older, less people to follow. And that means, well, the whole continent gets older and older and older. And as you can see here, over 10 years, a lot of countries had a lot of increase in terms of the share of, over 65-year-olds. Sorry, I forgot the title here. And you can also see that, so this is 65 and plus, what's the share? And you can also see here that the median age in Europe is just increasing over time. And well, what does it mean for real estate? Another thing, and so to say, the other end of the life cycle is student housing. But now we also have these aging, so we have a lot of more older people. Usually these older people also were more wealthy, because usually income increases with age, and that led to the development of a new property class, and that's called senior housing. And it's exactly the same as student housing, just a little different amenities, but you also have, for example, more social activities, because a lot of people, when they're very old, they are alone, so they want to have social friends around and so on. So yeah, that's the emergence of social housing. And here you can see some stats on that. It's also a very demanding factor. And before we close this, and as said, I can continue for hours, there are two other things that you should keep in mind when you look at the factors and you want to analyze. One is natural constraints, and well, they're very obvious, but they're often overlooked. And here you can see an example of San Francisco. And what is the natural constraint? Well, obviously it's water, right? So San Francisco is completely surrounded. It's just one side that is open, but here's, for example, a natural park. So there's no much grow possible in to these areas, right? So yeah, and these natural constraints can be woods, can be mountains, can be water. And another factor are shocks. We just mentioned COVID, but there's also Brexit, for example, a very specific shock, obviously, to the European continent, to the UK. But we see, for example, companies moving away from London. So it has negative effects on London as a business business area. So the demand for office space decreases. But somewhere these people have to work, so we see in other cities around Europe that the demand for office space is just increasing. And with the office come obviously some workers, so same holds for residential and so on, so on, so. So these shocks are tricky because they're very hard to draw the connection between my real estate and what the effect could be, especially with COVID. We don't know yet. Time will tell. So, but yeah, keep the shocks in mind, and think about how they could affect the real estate projections. And then, very important, every market and property class requires an individual analysis. So what might hold true for one might hold true for the other. So, in summary, how would you approach this? First of all, define your property class, define your market or sub-market that you want to look at, and then you start with brainstorming what could be the macro factors and the micro factors that are involved here. And if you do this, then think about like you're putting all your life savings into this one investment of real estate, and you want to be 100% sure and convinced that this property has a lot of future value. Because if you're not, then obviously if you project it wrong, then we saw that if you use your space wrongly, it can take a lot of time until you can revert your mistakes. And in the end, that's very important. The final conclusion is always with the analyst here. So, there's a certain science behind it, but not all of them. It's a bit of art and decision making. All right, this was it for the first block. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much.